and welcome to Brussels, My Love, our weekly talk show about European affairs. On Brussels, My Love, we take a look at some stories that hit the headlines this week, find out what is at stake for you and Europe. And in case you were wondering, this isn't Maeve McMahon having grown older and bigger. I'm Stefan Grobes, sitting in for your usual host. Thank you for joining us here in the studio and on TV and online. Coming up in this edition, climate activism is turning violent. Who is paying the price? Some climate activists have become increasingly annoying, putting norms of civility and legal procedures to a test. Defacing the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, throwing tomato soup at Van Gogh's sunflowers, blocking popular sport events, flattening tires of SUVs and shutting down inner-city traffic. It's not energy companies or politicians that are being targeted, but art and ordinary people who happen to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. After exhausting normal democratic acts like voting, protesting peacefully or lobbying, some climate activists believe they need to escalate the fight to wake up their fellow citizens. But what if the same citizens only get angry at the activists? Could more forms of violence be next? And, speaking of violence and never-ending protests, is French democracy at its wit's end? The reform that raised the retirement age from 62 to 64 has left Emmanuel Macron deeply unpopular. Fueling discontent is the use of the constitutional provision to pass the reform without a full vote in parliament. Is French society in crisis, its political class, or both? Is the ongoing resistance a test for the French presidential system? And is a beleaguered France a risk to stability in Europe? Could there be spillover effects? Let's bring in our panel now and try to get answers to these questions. Now, first, Laura Sullivan, Executive Director at We Move Europe from Ireland. Welcome to the program. Reinier van Lanschot, Co-President of Volt Europa from the Netherlands. And last but not least, Chloe Mikolajczak, a climate and justice activist from Belgium. Welcome to all of you. Thanks for joining me here now in studio. So let's start with disruptive activism. It's a term that has been coined to describe a situation that we've seen more and more in several European countries recently. Activists have used attention-grabbing tactics like blocking roads, gluing themselves to trains or the streets. The results are a mostly angry public, tons of hate posts on social media, and sometimes less public support for the climate cause. In Germany, even the Greens put some distance between themselves and the last generation group. Yet, what is a sullied painting, a flat tire, an hour or two in a traffic jam in the face of a climate apocalypse that could end life on this planet as we know it? Is that a fair question? Laura, I want to start with you.
It's a great question. I'm glad you're asking it. I think you have to distinguish between a couple of things. I see a danger in this sliding narrative in the European media right now around the idea of harming citizens, which is not the case. SUVs are getting harmed or traffic is being stopped. And clearly this is annoying, but there is a big difference between that and violent action. So that's not what I'm saying. And certainly as We Move Europe, we engage people to take actions, but we will never, ever hurt anyone or allow for that to happen. I think the second thing is that we have to make a decision as society. Either we continue to sleepwalk through a sort of everything is awesome style world and try to hold out the idea that climate change is happening. And we know it very much here in Belgium because we saw the floods the summer before last. We saw the great suffering experienced by so many people who lost their homes and their families in Germany too, in the Netherlands too, and the list goes on. Right. We can either keep going, like forgetting about it, or we can wake up and smell the climate coffee. And the last thing I'd say on that is just that yes, we can have meetings with decision makers, we can have peaceful protests, we need that, but we also need actions that are causing us to talk about this.
This sort of action, is that justified?
I think, if anything, climate activism isn't hurting people, but climate change is. So at first, as somebody who is from Amsterdam and lives closely to the paintings of the Van Gogh Museum and who loves going there because I love art and paintings, at first I was like, ooh, why would they do that? But then I found out that there was glass in front of the painting, and it was actually a way to create a shock effect without actually harming the painting, and everybody was talking about it. So
everybody's talking about the shock effect, right? But does that lead to more support?
Well, I think it does. First of all, I want to say I do engage in civil disobedience as an activist. And I think that's one of the many, many tools that we have in our toolbox. But I think what we have to understand is two things. First, you mentioned violence. The activists are not violent. The policymakers and the fossil fuel companies and the status quo, that is violence. That is causing incredible hurtful situations in the global south and also in Europe at the moment. And so we have to sort of think about our tactics. What is being effective? And if you look at the history of social change, the most meaningful social changes happen after some sort of civil disobedience. So I think that's the first thing. And then the other thing is, yeah, it's one of the many, many tools that we have. But the question is, who are we harming? As you said, no one is being harmed. The SUVs are being harmed. And I think you can take the concept of common but differentiated responsibilities that are currently being used in international negotiations to say all countries are responsible, but to different degrees. And you can apply that to the people. You have to remember that 1% of the population is emitting double the amount of emissions as the poorest 50%. So yes, it's fair game to target these people and their consuming habits that are polluting.
You said at one point, you spoke about effectiveness. Now, if you block an ambulance that is stuck in traffic, if you prevent parents from taking their kids to, which is not the case, to a daycare center, well, people are going to work at 8 o'clock in the morning. So is this the right target? I mean, you're advocating for a stronger climate policy. That is absolutely a fair point. But you need to bring people on board, right? If you want to. You need to drum up support, public support.
It works. Just like it works, it does work. Studies have shown that there's a phenomenon called the radical flank effect. So if you have radical actions like that, it actually increases the support for more middle, center organization. So what they found that is in the UK, after the action of Just Stop Oil or Last Generation, it increased the public support for organizations like Friends of the Earth that are considered more traditional and that people tend to support more. So yes, it has an impact. It has a positive impact for other types of organizations. And just on the ambulance thing, because this is something that I've seen quite a lot, every single person that I've seen blocking a street, for instance, there was always a way for emergency vehicles to go through. So they weren't ambulances that were blocked.
This is an argument that I've heard a lot of time, but it's practically not the case. If a traffic jam builds up in front of people blocking the road, the people who enter the traffic jam, they don't know what's going on 100 meters ahead of them. So if there's an ambulance, the cars have not deliberately left open a passage here.
I wouldn't want to zoom in on this hypothetical example, but more talk about the activist dilemma in general that is as old as the road to Rome, which is by doing something that creates a lot of attention, you often need to cause disruption, and with that you can get attention for your cause, but also perhaps alienate a group of people that might otherwise support you. And that's nothing new with regards to climate activists. I think in a democracy, the fact that there can be forms of demonstrations and a certain amount of civil disobedience, that is a great thing. I've also participated in climate marches, not really in the civil disobedience ones, but as long as we are still subsidizing fossil fuels, we don't have an infrastructure that in Europe that makes continental flying obsolete, as long as we don't tax kerosene, as long as those easy to do measures are not taken for something that is this huge, then I applaud the climate activists. I'm personally more in the political sphere, but I'm happy with people that are fighting for something that I also try to prevent.
Great point. I mentioned the word annoyance in the introduction. You mentioned it well. I want to show you a clip, something that happened to a colleague of mine in Switzerland this week. Let's take a look.
No, sir, no. You're not going to stick yourself to the set. I don't believe it. Oh, but seriously. It's a disgrace, sir. You're taking a democratic program hostage. The people have voted today, and here you come, gluing your hand to the set. It's a disgrace. I refuse to co-host this show with you. It's a disgrace.
So, Laura, what does that do good to the climate cause?
The fact that we're talking about it now. So I think, it's whether you have a short-term or a long-term perspective on this. If the suffragettes were around today, they'd have a lot of hate on Twitter. And the issues that they were dealing with were maybe somewhat different, but we're dealing at the same time with an inequality time bomb in Europe and the world, at the same time as all of the very trustworthy organisations of the UN are saying we only have a few years before we pass basically unrepairable damage. And that will affect your family, my family, and all of us. So what we see in this clip is a person and people who are trying to get the message through, but the message isn't getting through. And if I can give you an example, today I engaged in an action on the streets to put up posters that say, end ecocide and make ecocide illegal. The Council are discussing today in trialogues at EU level whether the act of ecocide, poisoning water through oil spills, knocking down loads of trees in the Amazon for soya, etc., whether that should be a crime with consequences. But unfortunately, there's a number of member states, my own included, who have not decided whether there should be a law and whether CEOs should be going to jail and actually paying fines for this stuff. So we are not being heard. We are getting stuff on the agenda. Climate's on the agenda. Inequality is somewhat on the agenda. Ecocide, it's coming up. But the point is, it stops there. And what we're seeing there is desperation because we're not being heard and time is running out.
But is that if you're not being heard, do you need to take, let's say, illegal measures? Because you coerce people into a situation. You're damaging public property, private property sometimes. Although flattening a tire is not real damage, but it's annoying, right?
Yeah, okay.
So and again, I think the overall question is: can you bring people on board? And one other point: over the past years, European governments have spent and allocated more money than ever before on the fight against climate. Isn't that a sign that society is moving?
It's not enough.
Yeah, it's not enough. I agree. And I think we need to remember that the only reason that the Green Deal was actually adopted in the first place was because of the gigantic mobilization from the youth movement and the people that took the streets in 2018 and 2019. Your question was about whether we are going to annoy some people. But I think the real question is, do we actually need everyone on board to address climate breakdown? And the truth is, there's so many people who don't want things to change because they're benefiting from the status quo. They're benefiting from not changing anything. And that's the fossil fuel industry, but that's also people who in their daily lives have jobs that enable the fossil fuel industry, or polluting companies that drive extremely big cars, that fly a lot for holidays. And these people don't want things to change because for them, of course, it's super comfortable. Why would you question yourself when your life is comfortable, easy, and you can be in total denial about what's happening? But the truth is, when you're not in denial about what's happening, when you actually listen to the people that are the most affected, that's the pure violence. The pure violence is not doing anything about it. And honestly, if the fight against climate breakdown is going to cost a few tires, it's going to cost us to block factories, refineries, it's going to cost to block some streets even, I'm down for it. I'm down for it because this is what we need to do. We're nowhere near where we need to be. And you were mentioning the amounts, the millions that are currently being put. Yes, it's more than ever before, but still we're so far from what's needed.
And it's not all about money.
Yeah.
It's not all about money. So, for example, Germany doing the about turn on the phasing out of the combustion engine by 2030 recently is an example of where you can't just throw money at climate change. It's also about the policies and rules you put in place.
Yeah.
It's very unlike Germany to do something. And clearly that's not about the German population. That's the FDP and the car lobby. But essentially that's a very big problem to put Europe in. We have to phase out cars. Right. Some are doing it. Go to Copenhagen. A friend of mine just came back. She said, it's amazing. There's no cars in the street. How did they do it? They decided to do it. And you cannot just click your fingers and do it overnight because you've got working class people who got cars as well need to go to work. You got to do it fairly, and you've got to build up a public transport system that works for people.
we've seen over the years more and more radical protests, and I've mentioned them at the beginning. It looks like that even these street blockades don't lead to anything. Do you think that this is just another step on a further escalation? Can we expect more and more, forceful, solid?
I read a book over the summer which was called The Ministry for the Future, where a great book, I can highly recommend it, where they basically address the situation and how it will unfold in the coming decades with regards to climate change. And part of that fictional novel is also that there is a violent group who takes violent actions. And that's something that, of course, I think we all agree are entirely against. So there might be a certain escalation ladder, but so far I would like to challenge whether it has been ineffective. I think some of these actions have been very effective and will also translate into policies that will translate into law and materialize in society.
Are there limits of legitimate protests?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's limits, and I think, as you said, we can all agree, I don't condone violence, I condemn violence, and I will never engage in actions that are violent against people. However, I do engage in civil disobedience, which is illegal. And I think that's where the line is between what's legal and what's moral and what we should be doing in the future. And I think right now these actions are considered illegal, but I think in a few years they will be considered very, very moral. And I would just like to go back to what you were saying in terms of, once again, it's who the targets of these actions are. Personally, I don't think that blocking a road at 8 a.m. where people are going to work is the most effective thing to do. I understand this tactic, but I would personally not engage in it.
Prompts the biggest backlash. Right?
It does, and I don't necessarily think that's the most effective thing, but I do think that, for instance, targeting SUVs or targeting, not a few weeks ago, I blocked the private jet terminal here in Brussels. Typically, I think these are extremely good targets. Yes, it's still individuals, but it's individuals who, despite everything, are still happy to take a private jet that's going to emit way more than, a normal plane or a car or a train. And they're still choosing these modes of transportation despite the impact. I think targeting these people is fair game, and they shouldn't be targeted by us. I'd just like to emphasize this. I don't want to be an activist. I don't want to go glue my hand somewhere or block a street. I would much rather think about my next vacation. I have to do it because I'm terrified for my future. And I think targeting these people that do not want to change at all and that are really happy to continue living their lives the way they are and polluting, yes, I'm going to continue doing that.
I mean, this comes with a heavy price tag, and these people are risking, huge fines and even jail time. Is that if you were, father of a kid?
It's an individual decisions. I never intended to go into politics. I was working for a supermarket company, but I was concerned about certain things that I saw in society, and the lack of humane migration policies was one of them, but the lack of action on fighting climate change was also one of them. And I decided to take a more active role in political entrepreneurship to create the first pan-European movement with a large group of Europeans. And I think everyone should, if they care about a certain cause, should use the method to advocate for that change that is closest to their heart and best suits them in order to be effective. Because in the end, impact is the goal. And for me, that was becoming active in politics. But people who choose civil disobedience and climate activism, I also sympathize with, because they're fighting for something that I'm fighting for as well, but through a different method.
Laura, quick reaction before we take a break.
Yeah, so I would just first say it's not just young people. So most of the people I speak to in the We Move Europe community, a lot of them are retirees who say, when I ring them up and say, why are you prepared to go on the street? They say, I'm really worried there's no future for my grandkids. And this is a real feeling. It's not just a lot of flighty young people who really get this. It's a much broader part of the population. I really agree with what you just said around, Elon Musk's spaceship to the moon. It's the same emissions as one person for their entire life in the global south. So, what's that?
All right. Thank you so far for a great conversation. We're going to take a break now. And when we come back, what's the matter with French democracy? Should we be worried? That's next on Brussels, my love. Stay with us. Welcome back to Brussels, my love. Our guests are still Laura Sullivan, Chloe Mikolajczak, and Renier van Lanschot. Let's move on to our second topic, the situation in France. For months now, the country has been rocked by protests against what should have been a regular political process, a big overhaul of the pension system. A project that was a central part of Emmanuel Macron's campaign platform when he was running for re-election a year ago. As it was not clear whether he had the presidential majority for the reform, Macron opted to use Article 49.3 of the French Constitution, which forced the legislature to pass the reform or hold new elections. After the Constitutional Council approved the reform bill, Macron signed it into law a few weeks ago. Yet, unions keep fighting the reform, and last Monday, May Day, saw probably the most violent clashes between protesters and police. So, what's wrong with France? The pension reform is now the law of the land. Why does the confrontation continue? Who wants to go first?
Nothing is wrong with France. I'd like to say that nothing is wrong with France. If anything, I think it's very healthy what's happening. You have to understand the context. So before the pension reform, it was Elisabeth Borne, the Prime Minister government, used the 49.3 more than 11 times, I believe, in her 1 year of mandate, first year of mandate.
She wasn't the first Prime Minister to do so, right? This has been a recurrent thing.
But she's the only
politics.
one who's done it so many times in such a short amount of time. So I think there's a very big tiredness and exhaustion from the French people that feel like they're not being listened to by the government, and that was sort of the last drop, the pension reform. And I feel like it's really healthy that they're expressing their disagreement like this, and I think it's incredibly beautiful from a democratic point of view that the demonstrations are still happening, that people are still going on the street, they're still willing to lose money to go on the street and protest and express their voices, and I haven't seen that in a very long time, and I love seeing that. And I think, of course, there's
violent clashes, healthy?
No, violent clashes are not healthy, of course. But I'd like to say that the violence is mainly, and maybe this is going to be controversial, but when you look at the numbers, the violence is mainly from the police side. And actually, the UN just said that there's a big problem with police violence in France. So it's not just a bunch of people on Twitter. There's a gigantic problem with that.
I mean, we've seen the police were attacked with.
Of course, but it's a minority.
It's not only the police.
It's not only, but it's majority.
I would say that France has a problem. The political system has a problem with representation. There's no proportional representation. Political parties in France are not used to forming coalitions and collaborating. The presidential system, I think, which was instated in 1958, if I'm correct, hasn't evolved while society has. And that leads to a system where people do not vote for a candidate, but they vote to avoid another candidate. And I think the protests we see are a symptom of that lack of proportional representation. And those fundamental changes in the democracy in France could make it better. And there was an attempt with citizen assemblies to get those voices heard, but the follow-up was awful, so it didn't succeed.
Okay, Laura, polls suggest that there's a majority that opposes this. But in a democracy, in a parliamentary democracy, once a bill is passed, it becomes law, and then it's the law of the land for everybody. The underlying question that I find is important here, if certain people kind of cherry pick whatever they like in a democracy and reject what they don't like and oppose it violently, isn't that a big risk for democracy itself?
I think we have to be really careful from our viewpoint here in Brussels about being too cynical and simplistic about what's going on in France. I just came back from a visit to Marseille, spoke to a lot of people, taxi drivers, teachers, my own colleagues, members of the We Move community. And, you know, the reality is that this is not just about 62 to 64. This is about a whole story of, can I survive the month? Is my salary enough with inflation, etc.? So there is a whole tension, which is really about inequality that is embedded in the system in France and in Europe. And related to that, I think Macron has really messed up. Things were going well. He put in place one of the most exciting citizens' assemblies. The process was so good. But as was just said, you know, the recommendations came from people who gave a whole lot of their time to recommend on climate change. He did nothing with them. So it was so close to being a great story for Europe, and he let it go. He also, on the vote, let it go.
come to that European aspect in a minute. But first, I want to bring in a reaction from Renew Europe, Macron's party here in the European Parliament. Unfortunately, they couldn't be with us today here in the studio, but they sent us a statement. Here it is. It comes from Sandro Gozzi from Renew Europe. France is a democratic country. Macron said what he was going to do, and he did what he said. Representative democracy has won against mass populism. Your take, Chloe.
That's just such a symptom of what's going wrong with Macron's party. It's such a disdain for the people. It's just such a disdain for months and months of mobilization, seeing so many millions on the streets on a regular basis, seeing the unions coming to them and then just pretending that they never wanted to come, or that there was never an agreement, or actually they were never invited. They're completely disconnected from the reality of the people. As Laura said, I think it's way wider than the pension reform.
But wasn't it in his
Yeah, but what you have to understand is that people didn't vote for Macron. They voted against Marine Le Pen. No, they voted against Marine Le Pen, and there's a big difference.
That's
and he knows that.
No,
he knows that. He knows that all the polls were saying it. He knows that. He's aware of it. And he also knows that he doesn't have a majority. So imagine the optics when you're constantly forcing a program where you don't have a majority, and when you know that the vast majority of people didn't vote for you for your program, they voted to prevent the far right. So I think a little humility from Macron and his party would be most welcome, and they're clearly not showing that at the moment.
Do you agree?
I was on another train of thought, actually. I hope you...
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, because I was thinking about another symptom that's actually causing the lack of people feeling heard and seen, and that is that France has a democratic system where it's incredibly difficult for political newcomers. As Volt, we are trying to create political parties in all EU member states, and it's way more difficult in some countries than in others. In Greece, for example, we recently were rejected to participate in the elections that are in 20 days for a formality that was absurd. And in France, you need so much money and so much clout and support even to be able to participate meaningfully in the elections, that also causes a lack of democratic newcomers to be able to get their voice heard. Sorry.
To you further, but that's all we have time for on that topic.
I got carried away.
We'll not go away anytime soon. Thanks to our panel here in the studio, and thanks for watching. See you soon here on Euronews. Welcome back to Brussels, my love, our weekly talk show about the week that was. And the week that was came up with a shocking number to all those who have been worried about consumer prices. And here it is, 7%. That is the increase of inflation in the Eurozone in April compared to a year ago, which was basically in line of expectations. But this came with some unexpected good news. The underlying price growth, that is the core inflation without volatile stuff like food and fuel prices, slowed from 7.5 to 7.3%. So, what to make of these numbers? Who wants to go first? Laura.
In September, when, one of those moments last year when things were really hard, we did a survey of 1 million people that belonged to the community that was We Move. Huge responses, people all saying the same thing across all countries. We're being inflation to death here. And so we have a commission department called the economy that works for people, is that right? The economy is killing people right now, and this inflation is killing people, and it really is serious.
So what is in store for people, for consumers like you and me going forward?
Yeah, well, I notice it in my daily life a lot as well. And I think with these high inflation numbers, the people that are in the most difficult positions get the hardest hit. And for me, the unwavering support of Ukraine is essential. We also need to continue to fight for climate change, and that's only possible if the people that are struggling with the high inflation do not get lost along the way.
I'm not a banking expert, so I don't know if the inflation has an end in sight, but what I would like to say is, well, the economy is killing regular people like you and I. It's actually allowing big companies to make historic profits. So while people are struggling at the supermarket or to pay, or they have to choose between heating and eating, the biggest fossil fuel agri-food companies are making billions in profit, historic profits. And so I feel like what needs to be done right now by decision makers is, of course, tackle the inflation, but make sure that we're not letting these companies off the hook. And when we think about the energy policy, which is the main driver of this crisis right now, we are at a real risk of locking the EU into more fossil gas for decades to come. And that will not only be terrible for the climate, it will also be terrible for consumers. And that is the fossil fuel industry right now is heavily influencing EU energy policy. So we need to make sure that every policy on inflation is good for people, is also good for climate, because that will avoid such inflation in the future, but also holds accountable these companies for all the bad that they're doing and all the money they're making out of this.
Are you worried as a young citizen? I mean,
Terrified.
Younger than me. The economists have said, okay, it's going to be up and then it's going to go down because the effects of the war in Ukraine will subside. That is a big unknown here in this.
We know what to do. We have opportunities to put in place windfall taxes that address that problem. We can absolutely make sure that we're, supporting households much more so that are particularly affected. We've got to sort out the gas and electricity markets question, insulation. All the solutions are there, but again, we're not being heard. And on those ones, these aren't just little issues. This is massive.
Yeah. René, what's your take?
Fair taxation and tax justice is an incredibly important element of this in the short term, and in the long term, we should pivot our economy to have more sustainable prosperity.
Yeah, and on youth, I think it's not just the inflation. We're terrified of climate breakdown. We're terrified that we're not going to be able to choose what we want to do in the future. We're terrified of so much. So I think it's just a broader, we are at the tipping point. As Europe, we've got choices to make. We can go either in the direction of a more fair, more just, more social, more environmental friendly Europe, or we can go towards more inflation, towards keep giving gigantic tax breaks to big companies and letting people really struggle. And I don't want this Europe. I want a Europe that is more fair and that people will actually be proud to be part of and will actually go and vote and feel involved in.
On that optimistic note, that does it for us today on Brussels, my love. And if you want to reach us, reach out to us, you can send us a note to brusselsmylove@euronews.com. Comments or ideas, or you can go on social media, Euronews on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or TikTok, for example. All right. I'd like to thank our guests here in the studio for their insights and our audience for watching. I'm Stefan Grobe. See you soon here on Euronews and Euronews.com.